Privatization in Israel, and the title of his presentation is State Responsibility and the Boundaries of Privatization, an overview of the privatization process in Israel. And I did not mention that Professor Galnoor is the academic director of the Privatization and Regulation project here at the Leer, Jerusalem Institute, and also emeritus professor at Hebrew University.
Hello, I would like first to welcome my Turkish colleagues for coming to Israel. The idea of having this meeting came up during a meeting we had in Istanbul on democracy. And some of us, Mickey and myself and some other people mentioned, in discussing Israeli democracy, mentioned privatization, as a result of which some of our Turkish colleagues say, we have the same problem, let's say, or the same phenomenon. And this is how the idea of having this joint session came about. And I'm very glad that we managed to do it, and I would like to thank all of those. I'm not going to mention the names because it's time is running, but thank you very much, and also thank you, Professor Onder, for starting the discussion. Now, I think Turkey and Israel have been going a process of privatization for 30 years or so. And I think it's about time to ask a very simple, naive, even simplistic question. Has it been good? Has it been bad? Has it been partially good? Has it been partially bad? And I'm saying this because in many countries, from which I think both Turkey and Israel learned and were influenced by, and were influenced by the process of privatization, in many of those countries, particularly Britain and some of the other countries, New Zealand and Australia, there is now a process of thinking over, asking exactly the question that I've asked, mainly in terms of the different sectors, but also as a general question regarding the role of the state, the role of the government, the question of the core function and so on. And I think it would be a good start for us to say, why is it that in our countries this process hasn't started? I mean, it has started a little bit here in Israel, as I'll try to point out, and I wonder whether it has also started in Israel. So I think it's time to look into this question, and also why during this long period there has been a failure to articulate what is state responsibility, and also what should remain inherently governmental. Now I'm using the American expression, or some other people, core areas in which, no matter if it makes sense in terms of economic terms, no matter if it brings money into the budget for a certain year, those things are not to be privatized for social, environmental, and other reasons. So I think we should start with some of those general questions, how to draw this line between privatization and non-privatization, how each state can define those areas in which state responsibility should remain intact, particularly in an era in which the state as an institution is been going through a process of being less involved in many areas because of globalization, etc., etc. It is very important, and it's important for each country to find its own answers. There is no one answer. And we have to look also into areas in which not only privatization, selling government corporation and enterprise, but also this other thing that has been going on, I'm sure also in Turkey, I'm sure, and we are going to discuss it, this very popular thing of using expert outside government, which no one could say anything against it. I mean, you have a company that is good to do something, so the government contract out or outsources and so on. But it's as many other things became a fashion. Now I'm talking about Israel, and questions regarding privatization should include outsourcing, even though the answer you get when you ask, you make this point is, wait a minute, outsourcing is different, right? I don't know if this is the answer in Turkey. Outsourcing is not privatization. And I have news for those who say it. Regarding Israel, outsourcing is privatization. And even though theoretically the government remains responsible, at least in Israel, the government sometimes find it impossible to be responsible because of processes that I'll mention in a moment. So even though the answer is let's outsource and remain responsible, or let's outsource and regulate and so on, in practice, at least in Israel, we find that this is formally true, but practically almost impossible. In fact, the responsibility as well as even the regulation moves to other places. So let me now move to Israel and start with a quotation. Privatization is the most significant, comprehensive, and consistent policy in Israel since the mid-80s, almost independently of which party or leader was in power. It's an interesting point in Israel. There has been no assessment of this policy, neither on the macro level, the aggregate effect and influence on Israeli economy and society environment, nor even on the macro level, on the micro level, in certain areas such as water resources, pension system, health, education, and so on. This quotation is from a book which I happen to have here. This is for the Israeli audience. This is the result of our research here at the Leer project.
It's also for the Turkish audience.
Yes, it is. Those who know Hebrew. But the book will be translated into English and be published by Palgrave hopefully next year. I don't know if we're going to have the same title, but the title in Hebrew is Privatization Policy in Israel, State Responsibility and the Boundaries Between the Public and the Private. Okay, having said that, let me quickly go into some of the areas. Since we had a presentation by Michel on the overall economic environment of this, let me just emphasize the point that he made, which is very important. The changes in Israel included a dramatic change in public expenditure. And when I say dramatic, it's because I'm not a very dramatic person. Remember the numbers he gave. He said in 1977, the public expenditure part of the GDP was 71%, and now it is less than 40%. So this is within 3 decades, it's dramatic. Now remember, this includes the defense expenditures, which has relatively gone down for a while, but now it's been going up again. So if you deduct the defense expenditure, which on overall, let's say, remained the same or even increased a little bit, it is really remarkable, this change from a country which was centralized, was a strong welfare state, to a country in which market economy is not just a slogan, but a reality. And the reasons, I'm sure, would be familiar to all our Turkish colleagues. I just go through them very quickly. Why privatize? Well, you reduce the size of the state. I like to say not of the government, because the state, you reduce the state. Governments don't know how to manage efficiency, overcoming market failures. We have to introduce market flexibility. We can discuss all of this later, and it's going to come up in the discussions of specific areas, so I go just through it. Reducing corruption. Let me mention that. Reducing corruption is one of the reasons that even the IMF in the past, but not anymore, but certainly in Israel, was one of the reasons why you should privatize, and this is of course ironic because usually for every public corrupt person you need somebody with money to bribe him or to corrupt him, usually, and so on. Corruption is not just in the public sector, I'm told. Of course, there's always this thing which we find in many other countries, if you look into comparative study, that there is a need for money, so you have a fallout, you sell a government corporation, you cover the budget deficit, of course, for 1 year or for 2 years, nothing more, and introducing competition, reducing the power of trade unions. We're going to hear about that too, and so on. So in Israel, the main areas, let me go very quickly before I go into the actual findings of our research, was government corporation, which were, we had about 160 government corporations in the early 80s, and now we have 94, figure for 2014, 94 government corporation, and as in many other countries, what was sold was telecommunication, natural resources, transportation, the national airline, El Al, shipping company, oil and gas exploration, and many more, not electricity for political reasons, and not the ports yet, even though they are on the list to be privatized. 94 government corporations is a little misleading because many of them are not actually business corporations. They are some kind of antique remains of things that were done in the early years of the state. So in fact, we have even less than that, about, let's say, 40 or 50 government corporations. The other thing is outsourcing, which is still going on, as a result of which you find many government ministries. And I was in government for a while, and if I compare the government I remember to the government that I see today, you can see that the ministers are not responsible for many things, even though this was outsourcing and so on. And we have made, as part of the study, we looked into certain areas, even into the area of designing policy. One of the policy studies we made was into the design of policy, whether the government is outsourcing design of policy. Yes, Israeli government is design. Israeli ministers are outsourcing, and sometimes part of the bid is to ask those who compete not only to give answers to certain questions formulated by the government, the ministry, but also to formulate the question, which is more or less the end. This is on our scale of responsibility between 100 and 0, this is more or less 0 responsibility if you let somebody else define the problem for you. And I'm talking about the Israeli government, who actually let the Rand Corporation, I have to be careful here, formulate the problem for them on strategic economic and social policy. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. And it didn't stop in government corporation outsourcing. All social services in Israel, with no exception, health, education, welfare, pension, and so on, all of them have been partially or in certain segments. We'll hear more about it. In fact, you wouldn't find an area in Israel, I don't know if it's true in Turkey, in comparison to many other countries, which I'm going to mention, you wouldn't find an area in Israel in which there hasn't been some privatization broadly defined, either government corporation sold or the whole service has been privatized or part of it, including what are core of the core. Security, tax collection, those are the ancient functions of state, right? I mean, the Turkish Empire was one of the examples, you know. Military, tax collection, and the court system. If I remember my studies of the Turkish Empire in in my BA degree. So in Israel, you wouldn't find it. You would find it certain areas, even those core areas. So what did we find in our thing, which applied to Israel, but I think I'm going to mention those or focus on those in which I think there could be some comparative studies. And let me say that we found those things also in other countries. We didn't study Turkey, but we looked into other countries, mainly countries which are parliamentary democracies, which are similar to Israel. And Turkey is still a parliamentary democracy, I'm told. I don't know for how long, but still talk about presidential systems. Okay. Here too, from time to time. And as I said, this is not in terms of, it's not comprehensive. We have, in addition to privatizing a government corporation that you have to go through a process of legislation and so on, we have what we call in this book privatization by omission. Namely, a deficit is created in a certain area. The next thing you hear is that the ministry cannot handle it, doesn't know how to handle it. People are suffering, health system is going down, education is going down, the level and so on. Prisoners are suffering. I mean, there's a great deal of problem in the prison system and so on. So the first thing, there is a deficit. Government expenditures are cut. Second thing, there's thing that there's nothing you can do about it. The postal system in Israel went more or less down the drain. And the main thing is, well, what can we do, as long as those are, this is the government corporation. It used to be a government department. What can you do? I mean, government doesn't know how to manage, so privatize. If we just remain for a second with the postal system, the reason why the postal system is not functioning because it doesn't have a chance to compete with the private companies. The Israeli postal system is required by law to deliver post all over the country. As simple as that. Even to places that, you have one letter, once a week. But they have to go there. All the others don't. So they cannot compete. And there have been government appointments, and the managers should have been kicked out and so on. But this is used as a reason to say, well, government cannot run a mail system. I'm not saying that government can run, okay? I want to be clear. I'm just pointing out to the system of privatization by omission, and we have many examples of that. Second, in fact, there is lack of accountability. Okay, I'll go through the list even quicker. I'll just list them and we can discuss them later. We're talking about government and money and budget, and you can find different ways of looking at it, but in the end, there is lack of accountability and state responsibility is not exercised. Prison is one of the examples which went under the radar in many respects. Lack of adequate information, no real transparency. And what I mentioned already, depleting the capability of the civil service, of government ministries, so they lose expertise, they lose the ability not only of delivering services, but also of overseeing them or regulating them. And usually, not always, but usually workers pay the price under those titles of management flexibility, employment flexibility, and so on. Usually the flexibility is less on the management part and more in the section of the workers, but we're going to hear more about it. So, let me use the last 3 minutes on some of our policy recommendations that could be of interest. And this is included in the book. And it's not based only on those studies, it's based on the other policy studies that we did in other areas, which were not included here, in many different aspects of Israeli economy and social services. And we looked into pensions, health, absorption of immigrants in the policy, papers and contracted workers. We think that it is important for every state to have a list, simple list of what should be the core functions that cannot be privatized in any way and should remain a state responsibility, because we don't want to have private courts. Okay, let me give the most simplistic. We don't want to have. And courts are not efficient. And courts do not have to compete, etc., etc. We don't have. It's not that the courts should go into a market, and if it doesn't function well in the market, there is a market failure, then we ask the state, please take the courts and do it. No, the court from the beginning is not part of the market. I mean, this simple thing, I mean, has to be explained again and again. There are certain areas we don't want to put to market test. Even if you believe in a market economy, you don't want the tax system to be part of it. You can privatize a little bit, you can outsource, you know, something, but the idea that you collect, the state collect tax or the local authority collect should remain clear, and it's not clear, at least not in Israel. And I wanted to say something about things that should not be touched, but I'll leave it for later. So the first thing is to have a list including those things that are, even though they can make profit, even though sometimes it's a private product, it's a private good. You don't privatize it because the state, and there would be differences. In one state, the beaches should not be privatized, or national monuments should not be privatized because of cultural and national presentation. So for this, we prepared a bill, or a proposal for a bill, which would first force every government ministry to ask the simple question: is this something that belongs to the core area of things that are inherently governmental state responsibility and should not privatize? And if the answer is no, then you can continue and look into it. And we have a whole process of how to go with it. But if the answer is yes, it is part of the state responsibility, that should be the end of the story. Such as prisons. And we can discuss it or argue about it. I know that many countries have done it, usually outsourced it. The only country which completely privatized prison system, not the whole system, but part of the system, is the great democratic state of Texas. The state of Texas has completely private prisons. But the others, that's also, I don't know if there are private prisons in Turkey. Are there? No. Okay. No other country has done that. So that's the second thing that you have to do. And finally, you have to, once you decide that this is something that you want to do, then you go through a process of really listing out the real economic benefits, not the ones that are assumed to be, and the real social outcomes and the environmental outcomes. And for this we prepared, and this was mentioned by Werner Pushra, our manual for government ministries that we hope would be used in order to put some order, rationality into this area. So now I think we are in an area, and this is my last sentence, of trying to reassess, rethink the whole process of privatization, even though in Israel, for instance, it keeps going on and continues. I mean, there is a proposal now for privatizing or selling some government corporation or part of the government corporation. I think it's very important now to stop and start asking questions where we go from now. I think it's very important, and many countries are doing it. And we should remember this is a very long process. Privatization is a long process. It takes a long time, and usually more than a decade to see the impact. So if I may quote the famous Chinese, they say that one step starts with 1,000. A trip of 1,000, to get the Chinese right is very difficult nowadays. A trip of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, right? So I'm actually suggesting that we make this step in the right direction. So otherwise you move 1,000 miles in the wrong direction. Thank you.